Hey everyone, this is Phil, and in today's video, we're going to be going over 5 tips and tactics for beginners. Now, don't be fooled. Just because these are for beginners doesn't mean that they can't be useful to more experienced players too. In fact, these are the kinds of tricks that can help any airsoft player at any level win more engagements, improve their KD ratio, and just be a more effective force on the airsoft field. So, let's get to it. First off, let's talk about coming out of cover to shoot at an opponent. Whenever you come out of cover to shoot at an opponent, you want to try to do that from a different place or at a different height than you were before. Imagine you're trading shots with an opponent. The next time you come out of cover, it's quite likely that you're going to expect them to be where they were. And in fact, they're thinking the same thing about you. So if you want an edge, try coming out of the cover at a different height that you were before. Maybe taking a knee, for example. This is going to do 2 things for you. First of all, if the enemy was already shooting at you and they had BBs in the air and they were shooting at your torso, well, now you're crouched down, so maybe those BBs will just fly over your head. But secondly, and more importantly, if they were expecting you at chest height, say, and you're coming out at, ground level, for example, well, it might actually take them a couple seconds to realize where exactly you went, and depending on field conditions, they may not even see you at all. Either way, that extra time may just be the time that you need in order to be able to get some shots on target before they hit you. Now, as a beginner, it's quite likely you're not as comfortable shooting from your offside as perhaps a more experienced player, but shooting from the other side of a piece of cover can be just as advantageous for the exact same reason. The enemy player you were shooting at before is just not expecting you to come from that angle. If you're not comfortable shooting from your offside, you're obviously going to have to expose a lot more of your body in order to be able to utilize that side of a piece of cover. But it can still be really advantageous. You just want to be aware of what the situation is around you, where your enemies are, where your friendlies are, and so on, before you make that commitment. Finally, let's talk about emerging from the top of a piece of cover for a second. Emerging from the top of a piece of cover is pretty risky and is not something that I would generally recommend, especially to a beginner. This is mostly because when you come out from a piece of cover from the top, the first thing that's coming out is your head, and that really telegraphs to your opponents that you're about to come out from the top of the piece of cover. Your head will be out of the cover before your rifle, which gives them more time to shoot at you before you can actually return fire effectively. So you're really going to want to think about if this is the right thing to do. The other thing to consider is that being at the top of the piece of cover exposes you to a lot more angles of fire typically. So you may start getting shot at from people you weren't even engaging in the first place. So generally speaking, emerging from the top of the piece of cover is something that I would recommend most beginners avoid doing. Tip number 2 is a tactic. When you're in an area with a lot of available cover and you're playing a highly mobile game, as soon as you've shot at an opponent, move. Don't wait. Fire a few shots at your opponent, keep their head in the cover, and immediately relocate to another piece of cover. This is sort of expanding on tip number 1 in that you're trying to be in a place where your opponent is not expecting you to be in order to get a better angle on them and tag them out before they hit you. You will find that many airsofters are often reluctant to move a whole lot. Many of them will find a piece of cover where they feel safe and effective and stay there, often much longer than necessary. If an opponent just took a shot at you from a piece of cover, chances are they're thinking, the next time he comes out, I'm going to get him. Well, the truth is, if you're not actually behind that piece of cover anymore and they're waiting for you to come out of there, they're just wasting their time. Moreover, while they're waiting for you to come out of a piece of cover where you're no longer behind, you're maneuvering on the field trying to get a better angle on them. This is essentially flanking your opponents. You'll want to make sure that your opponent's head is well and truly in cover before you move, because if they see you move, this will obviously nullify the whole element of surprise. You'll want to pick a direction based on your opponent's position. Pick a direction that gives you a better angle on them, ideally along a route that will conceal your movement. That way, when you emerge from your new piece of cover, they will not have seen you get there and will not be expecting you. This tactic is easier to implement if you're by yourself, like in a 1v1 situation, but it's totally applicable to teamwork as well. You'll just want to make sure that you're coordinating and communicating with your teammates to keep good situational awareness. As a beginner, just focus on shooting and moving as soon as you can, as much as you can. Our third tip is to keep the barrel of your rifle up and pointed towards your opponents as much as possible. This includes when you're behind cover, while you're running, and especially when you're actively engaging opponents. Once the whistle blows, the targets that you're going to be shooting at will generally be up in front of you. They certainly won't be at your feet or up in the sky. So keeping your barrel up and ready to engage will absolutely reduce the amount of time it takes you to get up and on target, especially as a beginner. Sure, it can feel super cool to be backed onto a piece of cover with your rifle up, ready to spin around and engage targets, but in reality, this is very unlikely to be successful for you, especially if your opponents have their rifles ready and they're up and ready to engage you. So when you're applying tip number 1 and emerging from cover at different heights, focus on keeping your gun barrel up and pointing downrange before you come out of cover. That way, when you lean out of the cover, the only thing that you need to do is quickly acquire the target and pull the trigger. You're not wasting any time shouldering the rifle, bringing it up, and acquiring a sight picture. When it comes to running with your rifle, there's lots of different ways that people will achieve this. Generally speaking, how you hold your rifle when you run is dependent on how fast you want to run. So for example, if you want to run at your full sprint pace, the best way to hold your rifle is just by holding it with one hand and just start legging it. But for our purposes on the airsoft field, we're generally not going to want to run quite that fast. And there's a lot of different reasons for that, not least of which that the airsoft fields that we play on tend to be a little bit uneven, and running at your full pace is just asking to trip, fall, and break something. Ask me how I know. So in general, we want to run at a pace that is fast but controllable. That allows us to stop or quickly turn if we need to. And at a pace like that, we find it's easier to hold the rifle with both hands and keeping the stock over our shoulder. When we stop, we simply slide the stock into our shoulder pocket, keeping the barrel in line with our sight line. This makes acquiring your target super easy, and your first few shots will still be pretty accurate even after running. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to keep the barrel up and down range like this the whole time. Even a high ready position such as this is more than adequate. All you're trying to do is minimize the amount of time it takes for you to get your gun up on target in order to engage your opponents. And of course, you can certainly improve at this by doing ready ups from various ready positions, such as like a low ready or even a high ready. But for someone just starting out at airsoft, the best thing to do is to just focus on keeping your rifle barrel up and pointed downrange as much as possible. Tip number 4 is an old gunfighter saying: if something is worth shooting, it's worth shooting twice. I live this on the airsoft field, and people roast me on the Discord for shooting so much, but the reality is that airsoft accuracy is not an absolute thing. There are so many factors that affect our ability to hit a target with one single BB, including the wind and concealment. Even a small twig or a light breeze can cause a BB to go off target, and while you do see more consistency issues with entry-level guns, even highly tuned airsoft rifles will have the occasional flyer. Unfortunately, there's only so much accuracy that you can expect from a toy gun shooting plastic spheres through a smooth barrel. There's also the added reality that airsofters wear personal protective equipment like knee pads, helmets, plate carriers, etc. And even if you hit them in a protected area, they may not even feel the hit. And if they're actively engaged doing something else, like moving for example, they may not hear it either. Consequently, if you are going to be shooting at someone, it is almost always worth it to fire multiple BBs at them. Shooting 2 or more BBs at your opponent every time will dramatically increase your chances of landing a successful hit, of avoiding random inconsistencies between shots, and increase the chance of the other player actually noticing the hit. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to switch to full auto and just spray other players. Although shooting full auto is fun, it's a lot more effective and cost effective to fire several controlled shots on semi-auto instead. Now, obviously, if you start shooting 10,000 rounds per game, that's going to start getting expensive pretty quick. But for a beginner or an average player shooting a normal amount of BBs per game, shooting an extra 2 or 3 BBs per engagement is not really going to break the bank. BBs are still relatively inexpensive, especially when you compare them to ammunition in other similar sports like paintballs or first strike round. So spending a little bit of extra money on a few extra BBs is going to be well worth it when you consider your improved performance and ability to take players out on the field. Finally, our last tip is to communicate. Whether you're a brand new beginner or you've been playing Airsoft for years, the best way to be an asset to your team is by passing important information on to them. You don't need a fancy radio or 50 different hand signals to be an effective communicator either. In fact, when it comes to communication, the simpler, the better. We routinely see airsofters, even experienced airsofters, not communicating enough or at all on the airsoft field. They feel like they have to be Sam Fisher or Solid Snake, super sneaky, dead silent. The reality is that airsoft is a team activity and games are generally won by teams, not individuals, especially if you're a beginner. Thankfully, communicating is super easy to do. First of all, think of your average weekend skirmish. Chances are both teams already generally know where each other is at the start. Think of an attack and defend game, for example. The attackers definitely know where the defenders are, so they should be speaking, communicating out loud, passing information on to each other. On the flip side, the defenders might not know exactly where the attackers are at the start, but as soon as they start shooting, the jig is up. So the attackers should be then communicating out loud and passing on information. Now, this isn't to say that stealth gameplay doesn't exist. It's absolutely a thing. But if you're just starting out, chances are you're probably not as sneaky as you think you are. So, what is the best, most effective way to communicate? Well, as I just said, when you start shooting at someone, they definitely know where you are. So you should use that as an opportunity to pass information on to your teammates about what it is you're shooting at, using clear and concise language. For example, I'm shooting at two guys behind the green car to our right. Don't get hung up on tactical cool guy lingo like 2 tangos, 3 o'clock, 17 meters, window 1-2, behind the green import sedan. Just say what you mean clearly and concisely and make sure that people around you understand what you're saying. If you're working with a teammate, by doing this every single time you shoot, you'll help them keep better situational awareness, which will help them make better decisions to support you and your team on the field. Now, if you're not actively engaging an enemy, maybe because they're too far away, you should still be passing along important information using clear and concise language and obvious visual landmarks. For example, I just saw 5 guys moving from the right, from the fuselage to the tree line. Again, avoid overcomplicating things with lingo or estimating distances. Even if you're an expert at visually gauging distances, chances are the people you're passing that information to are not. And at best, it's only going to be marginally more useful than the visual obvious landmarks you would have said, but at worst, it's going to confuse and complicate things for the people you're passing the information to. So at the end of the day, stick to clear and concise language and make sure your teammates understand what it is you're saying to them. By doing that, the team can have a much better situational awareness and you'll be better off for it. So if you're a beginner, consider applying these 5 tips and tactics at your next Airsoft game. They will help you be much more effective on the field and enjoy more success from your day of Airsoft. If you're a returning player, make sure these tips and tactics are part of your skill set. And if they're not, well, that gives you something to work on. Thank you so much for watching this video. We hope you enjoyed it. If you want to keep the conversation going, please join us on our Discord. The link is in the description below. If you like the video, make sure to subscribe or leave a comment. It really does help us out a lot. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.